Hi, it's Dr. Ann Metz, and this is The Psychedelic Skeptic, where we believe nothing is the cure for everything. If it's your first time here, I'm a licensed therapist, counseling professor, and in fact, a psychedelic therapist. But I'm also a skeptic when it comes to some of the claims around psychedelic medicine, and that's what I'm here to explore. Today on the show, radical empathy and cultural humility in psychedelic spaces.
I think psychedelics are incredible for showing us possibility. They show us myriad possibility with no limit. And so from that, we can come back into the world, and through the integration process recognize that it's possible to be curious. It's possible not to be an expert, regardless of our credentials or our whatever we've earned. We can move back into the world from that open mind with the curiosity.
Today on the show, we welcome Dr. Bealika McCaw, a cultural consultant, educator, and healing practitioner whose work bridges psychedelics and social justice. As a Kenyan-born Black queer scholar who left academia after experiencing systemic inequities, Bealika brings vital perspective to our conversations about power and privilege in psychedelic spaces. Through her Radical Empathy Disrupts Entitlement, or READY curriculum, and its adaptation for psychedelics, Bealika helps practitioners develop culturally informed protocols that examine the narratives we've internalized about ourselves and others. In a field that is often overlooked cultural context and historical power dynamics, our conversation explores why cultural humility isn't just supplemental to psychedelic work. It's fundamental to ethical practice and meaningful healing. Join us as we discuss creating more equitable, culturally literate approaches to psychedelic healing. Well, Bealika, when we were trying to organize this interview, which thank you so much for being here, you happen to have a notice at the very bottom of your signature line about taking a technological Sabbath every week. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Certainly. So Wondrous Wednesdays have been part of my life for, I'm not quite sure how many years, but it's been at least a decade. And it is a digital Sabbath, as you said. My partner and I kind of came to this idea feeling not that either of us was like over committed to, being attached to our devices. I often have my phone in the other room. I don't know where I put it. I'm not checking my texts all the time. I don't have notifications turned on. But we really both wanted to have some time that was dedicated midweek, like during the typical work week, when we just weren't, we weren't expected to be present online. And I think it came from a resistance to being workaholics, which I think, I definitely have that tendency. So we've made it a practice. It lasts from Wednesday noon until Thursday noon, which logistically has been really convenient because it means I can work in the morning until noon. So more and more it's been kind of lasting into the end of the day on Thursday. But yeah, it's a really beautiful practice. We take a sacrament and set our intentions, and and so that's been a lot of fun. And it's a beautiful practice. And the more I talk about it, the more I'm hearing people trying to do at least a version of that. So even if it's just a few hours of the day, to get off of those devices, to not be attached to a screen, I think that there are always beneficial results from that.
Wow. Well, I didn't really anticipate that the answer would be an interesting blend of kind of cultural pressures and ritual and also psychedelic use. So I think that's a really neat segue into the conversation that I hope that we're going to have around culture, cultural competency, and psychedelic spaces. I'm really curious about what led you to develop your framework, your READ framework.
I will start by saying it's pronounced READY.
READY,
yeah,
okay.
Which is important. So it's an acronym, and I'll tell you what it stands for in a second. But the word that it creates is READY, and I like that because it means that I can offer something called Ready for Psychedelics, or ready for some other cultural practice or change. So READY stands for Radical Empathy Disrupts Entitlement. And kind of working backward, I was trying to solve for the entitlement part of the equation. And I mean, the reason I came up with it in the first place, quite frankly, was to save my own life and that of others like me. So I know that sounds maybe a little hyperbolic, but I feel that radical empathy is a way of moving us, all of us, past the stories that we've been told about ourselves, about who we are and what, as a result, we feel entitled to. And so that entitlement can also include what we don't feel entitled to. Like, I don't feel entitled to be treated with respect, or I don't feel entitled to my own time, like the freedom to choose what I do with my day or choose what I do with my time. And so there's a lot of liberation tied up in that, which is for me a kind of central motivator for everything that I do. And so I created Ready because I wanted to have a practice that could be shared. It could be, iterative. It could be a methodology, and it's something I've been working on for the past 8 years. And initially, like I said, to save my own life, it came from repeatedly being in psychedelic spaces with people who were in such an open-hearted space because of psychedelic use and heart-centered space, wanting to be their best selves, and yet there were the practices of entitlement that just kept popping up, and I was often the recipient of unwanted touch, fetishization, by really good people who I knew wanted to be good people, and yet their actions were not combining with I think their intentions. And so I should mention, I'm a Black woman. I was in predominantly white spaces where this kept happening. And it often happened when I was most receptive and most open. And I think as a result, the impact was greater. I felt that impact even more profoundly. And I really wanted to find a way, a workaround. I wanted to find a way to solve, as I said, for that entitlement. And it meant really going deep into the heart of those questions, of who we are and the stories surrounding them.
What I'm wondering about as you're talking is this idea of radical empathy. And obviously therapists we talk a lot about empathy, but no one really talks to us about radical empathy. Can you unpack that for me?
Yeah, so it's a complex process. I'm always talking about process. And so the radical part of it, I think, is unpacking or maybe distinguishing between our relationships between self and other. And empathy, of course, we have the idea of feeling along with, and that works only to a point, because if we are not clear about our relational self, like how we relate to others, how we understand ourself in relationship to others, what I find is very often we're looking for the other, whoever we project that to be. We are looking for that other to fulfill something in ourselves, our sense of lack, something that we don't feel we have. And so that can be in terms of a cultural practice. It can be in terms of a racial identity. So often when I'm working with people around these questions, if I'm working with a white-bodied person, I'll sometimes hear the description like, I'm just white. Let's all identify our racial identities. Oh, I'm just white. Like our cultural background. That doesn't matter, and that suggests to me a kind of paucity of understanding of who are you. Just something suggests that it's not enough, or it's lacking. In doing cultural studies for decades, I've realized that in those conversations about ethnic identity or learning about the other, the quote unquote other, there's a lot of presumption that sort of ethnic studies will be the study of the other. And what Ready does is it brings it back to the self, and it completely reverses that process. We're not even going to talk about anybody else until we get clear about the self. So it's the empathy practice is not only with the other, it's primarily with the self. How do we understand the self? What stories have we been told about who we are? And often those stories do go back to that idea of, well, we're just this, or we're the norm, we're the mainstream. So there doesn't need to be a study of who we are. The difference is in the other. Let's look there first. So Ready, like I said, reverses that by suggesting this is an opportunity to know yourself better, to go deep into your own cultural practices and history and background, rather than starting from looking outward, a grasping for something that is not held by the self. And I think what I've come up with is just a simple statement of, by practicing ready, I don't expect you to fill the absence I feel in myself. So I don't expect you to fill the absence I feel in myself. Like, I don't have that expectation that if I feel some sort of lack, you're here to fulfill it or to fill that lack.
It sounds like that would be particularly important for people in psychedelic spaces, particularly providers of psychedelic therapy.
My hope is that therapists who have been trained in the Ready methodology can use it in the preparation part of the therapy process. So it's certainly not something you're practicing in the midst of a psychedelic experience. And you don't want to wait until the integration period for it. It's a preparation. It's important to begin by preparing the mind to unlearn those stories. And that takes some time. It's a process, like I said. So getting clear about those stories. So first, even identifying them. Kind of the very initial piece of the Ready work that I do is a series of questions, intake questions. So just getting clear about, what have you been told about who you are and how you are supposed to behave as a result of whatever those stories are telling you, whether it's like birth order, where are you in your family? What responsibilities do you have as a result of being, the eldest child, or maybe the youngest child, or maybe the female child in a family, of all boys? Like, all those stories combine to tell us who we are and how we're expected to behave, and maybe also how we expect ourselves to behave. And then in addition to that, you add race, you add class, you add educational background, faith tradition, all of those pieces of our identities that, because we know ourselves, or we think we do, we don't maybe question, we don't look to the context surrounding the stories. We stop at just our own familiarity with who we are. And so making a space for really dedicated interrogation of those questions of identity. Who are we? Why do we know that we are expected to act in a particular way? Giving that time and attention helps prepare us so that when we do move into maybe a psychedelic therapy space, we're not waiting for something to be added to our experience from that grasping space or that grasping place of desire for, I need something from out there that I don't currently have. We're coming into it with a sense of wholeness, or at least curiosity, that there are stories that we've been told, but they're not the only stories. And it certainly also prepares us then, I think, in the integration period and after, to apply the openness that maybe the psychedelic experience has introduced to us to the way we behave in relationships going forward. So again, like, that's the preparation, the experience, the integration, but having Ready at the beginning of that process means that we'll return with a mind of curiosity and not just a return to business as usual. Like, well, I'm just gonna, I had this amazing transformative experience, and yet I'm not allowing myself to be transformed by it. I'm gonna slip back into the familiar.
Where do you think privilege and power and oppression show up in psychedelics?
So, as I mentioned before, in my experiences, firsthand experiences of being touched without being asked for consent, having my brown body be viewed as accessible by strangers. And I'm not talking about like sexual assault. I'm not talking about really extreme experiences of harm in that sense. But I'm talking about people just reaching out to touch my skin and talk about it in really dehumanizing ways, like, oh, that's like chocolate, or touching my hair. And, again, strangers, not close friends that I have any sort of previous relationship with or history, but more, we're all in this together. And I should say, I believe fundamentally, yes, we are all one, but you and I are not the same. And that's another piece of Ready that I think gets to the heart of how we are relational beings, and even if we're spiritual beings having a physical experience, that physical experience has perpetuated distinctions that have historical context. So if my history is of a people who have been colonized and your history is of the colonizers, that is deeply ingrained, I believe. We have these intergenerational habits that may lead to reaching out in a state of, non-ordinary consciousness to say, I can have this, or I can touch this, or you're here for my use, which is a colonial instinct, right? Like I can take from a land and take its resources or take its people, which are part of the resources, and use it for my own use without any sort of sense of reciprocity, or perhaps even prior to the reciprocity conversation, we need to talk about consent. Like asking, are you permitting me to take this? So in the psychedelic space, we can always think about, the plants themselves, medicines. Where do those come from? Are they finite resource? Are they being over harvested to serve the purposes of, practitioners or recipients outside of that medicine's cultural home? And that basic exploitation, I think, ties very clearly back to the food, the food context of what had to be, who had to be exploited in order for this to reach me. So there's the pragmatic, and then there's also the sort of experiential.
Yeah, and I was going to say there's sort of the personal level as well too, where the story that you're sharing with us, it really, in a lot of ways, is the recreation of a system of oppression within the psychedelic space. The kind of world here says, Black bodies are here for our use and our utility, and in the psychedelic space, that sort of shows up again for you. And as you were saying that to me, I'm wondering, like, have I asked my clients about that, about their own experiences within psychedelic spaces of harm or of kind of racial trauma showing up? And so I just appreciate you talking about your own experience with it. I feel like it's been very illuminating just to even be thinking about that differently.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And also, it is very vulnerable to share it. It's not something, I don't lead with that story often, but I think it's really important to make folks aware. Because as I said, this has all happened, all of these experiences, and it's not just a few. It was a lot. And I've anecdotally, gathered stories from a lot of my friends of color who have had similar experiences, particularly in spaces where psychedelic use was part of the experience. And I certainly do not think it's because of the psychedelics. I think it's because of the ways we lack training prior to those encounters. Very few of us have had any sort of official training around decolonizing our minds, decolonizing our behaviors, our practices. And so within the psychedelic space, and certainly the psychedelic therapy space where you're saying, asking a client, like, have they had that experience? I would encourage also to ask yourself about, have I had an experience of, treating someone as utility, like treating them for their use value rather than recognizing them as their whole person. Now, that question alone is probably not going to lead to sort of these illuminating moments of, oh my gosh, I've done this thing. Most of us don't want to think about that. It's not part of it's not comfortable. And a lot of ready work includes, how do we talk about shame? How do we relate to it? And kind of going back to the academic example, when I would teach in the classroom, I was very clear, we're not here to relitigate what happened in the 19th century or before that. We know that there is this history. We know that happened. But what can we talk about now? Where are we seeing applications of this that we continue to live with? And instead of just thinking about where does the exploitation happen, might we start with, in what ways am I powerful? In what ways do I have privilege? In what ways do I have entitlement? Why do I feel entitled? Whether that's just in accessing a private education. Do I feel entitled to that? Do I feel entitled to live in this zip code? Do I feel entitled to be treated in a particular way with a certain amount of respect or authority simply because of the way I look? Or because of the PhD at the end of my name, or the MD or whatever. There can be all sorts of markers that lead to entitlement stories that just go unexamined. We just take it for granted. And so they're out there, and I think they're out there ready to be mined, as an opportunity to unpack and unlearn them. Like, maybe I have a PhD, but what does that actually mean?
You mentioned learning to decolonize ourselves and decolonize psychedelics. For folks who are not necessarily familiar with that term, could you maybe give us a little primer on decolonization?
Yeah,
it's a big question, I know.
It is. Like, let's talk about this like theory of practice in a soundbite. It's challenging, right? But I think it's also one of those stories that we are living within, again, without examining it very often. So a kind of colonial mindset is right back to entitlement, right? What do we feel we should have access to, and what does it mean for us to decolonize from the assumptions that we, I think, rely upon in some cases? And I'll give you an example. Like, I work a lot with organizations with using Ready within the organization spaces where a colonial mind might suggest my labor is more important than my work-life balance. My work, my productivity, that outcome of whatever I'm able to get done today is more valuable than whether or not I'm having a mental breakdown at the extreme end. Or perhaps I'm very much preoccupied with caregiving for an elderly parent in my home. That could be going on at the same time that, you have a job that's demanding X, Y, and Z. So it ties very closely to capitalism, right? The idea that, we're here for our use value rather than our individual, identities or lives or, spiritual contributions. So decolonizing from that is getting clear about what am I actually here for? What is my value? Do I have intrinsic value rather than value only dependent on productivity? Decolonizing also entails, again, getting familiar with that history. Why is it that my white boss is more likely to expect me as a person of color to do twice as much labor than my colleagues who are also white? Why is it, and I'll use myself as an example. So thinking again within the institution, with the academic institution, at my last university, I was the only Black woman faculty member. And there were only 3 Black faculty. And so the other 2 were men. And I was the only one who spoke about race in my classes. I was often talking with students about topics that were very near and dear to their hearts. They were identity-oriented topics. I also taught gender and sexuality. So issues that were coming up a lot for these students. And in their lived experience, they wanted to be supported by a faculty member and being able to talk about and do research projects on and read and explore. And as a result, I wound up having pretty much all the students of color who had those questions, or also white students who wanted to talk about that stuff. I had a very large load of mentees and advisees. And a lot of my white colleagues who did not talk about those kinds of identity issues, they didn't have the same workload, but we were all expected to produce the same amount of, written scholarship and publish papers and, give conference papers, all of those things. We were expected to collectively, we were supposed to be able to do all of that. But because of probably a bit because of my own identity, but more so because of what I was choosing to teach and what I was sharing in the classroom, there was a very unequal expectation. So having a colonized mind in that, I might not have questioned that. Like, well, that's just to be expected. That's appropriate. That's just, that's the way it's going to be. And that's how the status quo tells us. And I will say, as an example of what I just described, that's happening all over the place. It's not happening only in academia. It certainly does happen in those spaces, but it happens, in different work environments in all industries. And for me to decolonize my mind, I had to remind myself that was what my training was in. Decolonial scholarship, anti-colonial, post-colonial literature and theory. That's the area in which I earned my graduate degrees. And I wasn't living it. So there was this sort of cognitive dissonance between, well, I'm teaching this subject, so I can decolonize, but I'm still living as if it's okay to be the colonial subject. So that took a lot of unlearning, and that's a very long answer to decolonizing, but I think that's the process. Is that it is a process. It's a process of unlearning. It's recognizing those stories, getting clear on what they are, stories that ensure a hierarchy, a power over relationship, and then recognizing that that's not okay, and practicing resistance and refusal. I no longer want to be the colonial subject. I refuse that, and I think recognizing, for all of us, recognizing our individual liberatory power is necessary in that process to get clear about what we can say no to, what we can resist, and what we can advocate for, not just for ourselves, but for our communities.
Yeah, it sounds almost like you're hitting this fork in the road, that you can either choose the path of liberation or you can choose the path of continuing to stay into it. Because, I'm imagining that it went over like a load of bricks when you said, I'm not going to have twice as many or 4 times as many, because I'm imagining there's an intersectional thing that you're, a woman and you're also a woman of color, and that sort of doubles up your shift that you have to do. But that's a hard thing to be able to sort of say and to push back on, and say, this isn't fair.
Yeah.
Particularly when you're a young faculty member.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's interesting too. Yeah, the intersections of age, gender, and race. And I would also say, adding to that, like culture, because it was a lot. It was a lot. I'm actually Kenyan by birth, and I don't have African American family. And I was teaching about African American history and subject matter, and I had to teach myself that just as much as anybody, anyone who's not African American, which I'm not. And so that's also an interesting intersection, right? An intersectional identity that made me, I think, sought out as a resource in all of these different areas, even though I'm sort of self-taught in a subject matter that is not something from my own lived experience, which meant that any one of my colleagues who took the same interest that I did could have taught themselves as well. So you can see it's not fair. Just as you said, it didn't just go over like a ton of bricks. I left the profession. I mean, it wasn't as if I could have just refused and remained within that system. System-wide, I would like to see major changes in systems of oppression. That would be the goal. That would impact all these different industries, all the different institutions. But institutional power relies on that top-down hierarchical model. And, that certainly is apparent, I think, in therapy spaces as well.
Yeah. Liberation sounds like it's scary and hard, Yeah. Yeah. I don't know why that's kind of a obviously dumb thing to say.
It's not dumb at all. I think it's terrifying. True freedom, I think, is both entirely sought after. I mean, I think it's in our instinctual nature to want to be free, to want to live free. But we understand freedom so often through opposition. I know myself free because someone else is less free or is unfree, like bounded by whatever circumstances with, that could be a colleague who has a larger course load, or it might be just in the nature of, I have the freedom to eat whatever I want because someone else is doing, slave labor to produce and to harvest what it is that I'm seeking. There is that relational aspect to freedom that I think is entirely scary if you believe it has to be that it has to be the one or the other. So there's a lot attached to the binary thinking of, in order to be free, someone else has to be unfree. What if we could just all be free? What would that look like? And I think that's extremely scary to powers that be, that systems of dominance, and because it wouldn't work. It doesn't seem to be possible for all of us to be free.
Yeah, it does seem set up like a zero-sum game.
Precisely.
Yeah. To return back to what you were talking about earlier about experiences of oppression and harm within psychedelic spaces, psychedelics have sometimes been described as amplifiers. And it amplifies what you often already think about the world. And so I wonder to what extent psychedelics can really help us develop empathy, or if they can really hinder the
Yes,
process.
yes. Yeah, that's great because that ties us back to like why we need preparation work prior to the psychedelic experience. If you've done that preparation, specifically when I'm talking about like the ready process, like getting familiar with our stories, unlearning those that have been harmful, that are bias based, that are repeating or reiterating stereotypes that tell us that others, whatever that category contains, are like this, then we have the psychedelic experience. We're not, if we don't do that preparatory work, we might get very open and feel the freedom, and we can, this is the hindrance version. And then we come back out into the world and we just have those biases further cemented, and we practice, maybe the most egregious harms because we're thinking we're doing it from a place of and I think that leads to appropriation, cultural appropriation, and otherwise. Like we've decided that, wow, we're just, this leads to cultural bypassing, the idea that we're all one. And so I understand exactly what it's like for you to be oppressed because I know I've had this experience of oppression. And that may be a very, very different experience, but it becomes this sort of overlay. And I'm still looking at every experience through my own lens. Whereas the I think radical potential for positive change would be doing the preparatory work, realizing, oh wow, I have been hung up on these stories, but I'm now recognizing them just as stories, and I can write a new story about myself, what I am entitled to, or what I'm not entitled to. But more importantly, maybe through the experience of the psychedelic session, the whatever that experience contains, I'm recognizing possibility. I think psychedelics are incredible for showing us possibility. They show us myriad possibility with no limit. And so from that, we can come back into the world, and through the integration process, recognize that it's possible to be curious. It's possible not to be an expert, regardless of our credentials or our, whatever we've earned. We can move back into the world from that open mind with the curiosity. I don't know your story. I don't know your story until you tell it to me. I'm not going to look at you and assume X, Y, and Z because you fulfill, these stereotypes, or you look like you fill these stories that I've been told about people who look like you. So therefore, we don't need to discuss it because I already know everything I need to know. I think the psychedelic experience can be that view shifter or perspective changer to come back with an open mind and a curiosity and a humility, frankly, so that there's that openness to being taught something different, shown something different.
Yeah. Well, as you made this point, that it really depends on the preparation and, who's kind of running the show with preparation. And I sort of think about like, okay, well, who are people who've been involved in clinical trials? Who are some of the people that are getting licensed to be facilitators? And a lot of times they're people with lots of power in our culture space.
Yeah. I've thought about, well, just the notion of privilege in connection to psychedelic therapy work. To be a psychedelic therapist is the very definition of privilege, like to have the privilege to do this work and to do it above ground, to do it as a sanctioned practitioner, to do it with not all the legal freedom that you would want, but you have that, and certainly that's increasing. And I think that's a good thing. I think it could be an incredible thing, particularly if it leads to more consistent labeling. You can trust what is in the psychedelic that you're obtaining. You can trust that it's, this dosage amount is going to be consistent. But the privilege that comes from being in the position of the therapist, it can circumvent that deep unlearning that I'm talking about, because this is what the authority has deemed, to be the expert, or to be the person with power in this relationship. And I think that's still, for understandable reasons, and certainly historically grounded reasons, it's why there's still a lot of distrust about doing sanctioned, so-called sanctioned psychedelic therapy by, people who are members of marginalized groups. Those that are going to feel like I'm not going to get anywhere close to that because it's not safe for me. And maybe it's not safe because it's illegal, or it's legal only to a point. But maybe it's also because it's not safe for me to be in relationship, put myself into a position of power under someone who has historically held more power than I have had. Even, to the point of education, like having that education and the credentials that come along with it, that is already going to set up a power dynamic that I think could be improved if addressed with some really intentional language. What are we here for? What are our stories? What is your story? What is my story? And have that be an exchange, not just an extractive relationship. And I'm thinking not just extractive in terms of that we've already talked about, but also extractive of like the therapist is sitting and watching this person have an experience and kind of extracting from that experience what you'll then process together. And I think that's a very vulnerable position for a person to be in, particularly if they have had previous experiences of being fetishized, marginalized, and otherwise oppressed.
I'm at least happy to hear that you say that kind of having a conversation or having maybe many conversations about what it's like to sit with somebody who looks like me, who may, stand in for or resemble people who've treated you poorly in the world, I think is obviously a part of doing really good therapy, but it's also a part that sometimes white clinicians sort of shy away from, that it's like, don't bring it up somehow and it won't be an issue. I'm curious what advice you would have or suggestions for clinicians just to help make their work culturally more competent.
Yeah, I love that. I love that question. And I think it's important to also think about cultural competency as a fairly vexed term in the sense of competency can imply a kind of completed process, right? Like you take the workshop, you have 2 weekends a month, and now you're going to get the certificate of approval. You're now culturally competent. And I think that that's a fallacy. I think it has to be an ongoing, really a lifelong learning process. I always talk about with my clients with Ready that this is like you're signing on for something that really does not have an end. However, you're going to get the tools that will enable you to continue to ask these questions, but also new questions, primarily of yourself, not just of those others that you work with, but of yourself, and to keep revisiting those questions. Are these stories about me still true? Are they still applicable to my life, to my experience? The other thing I wanted to say is I don't have the goal of increasing cultural literacy skills, cultural humility skills, that's another term that I really prefer, among white practitioners so that they can increase the number of clients that they work with who are clients of color or in other ways differentiated from the clinician. I actually don't advocate for that. I'm really hopeful that we'll see more diversity in the practice space with clinicians from all sorts of various backgrounds, and being able to work with someone that does share some affinity. It may not be we look the same, but there may be other ways in which we have shared experiences or identities. What I'm really excited about is bringing Ready to white clinicians who are working with white clients, because I've seen it. I mean, the majority of my clients over the course of the now eight years that I've been offering Ready have been white. And it's in those spaces where I find a lot of movement happens, because there's just, like you said, there's this kind of unwillingness, like we're not going to talk about that thing because it's uncomfortable. Maybe it makes us feel bad. The feelings of shame that are often attached to, if we talk about issues of race and identity, I am going to be seen as the bad guy or the bad person. And, we don't want to be thought of as bad people. So let's just not talk about it. We're more invested in being seen as good people than in actually doing good things, do good work. And I think of Ready as enabling more people to do good work, not just to be, and yes, as an outcome, you'll be a better person perhaps, but I'm more interested and invested in the outcome of changed behavior. And I think that that does happen, particularly when people are given the opportunity and really the permission, perhaps. I think it's permission that we give ourselves, but having a space to provide that permission and say, we're going to actually pay attention to the uncomfortable conversation. We're going to say the thing that maybe you don't want to admit. Yes, I have power. Yes, I have privilege that is not enjoyed by everybody. Yes, I have privileges that are unearned. And that does not make me a bad person. I am not culpable for, history that I wasn't alive for, but I can be responsible and held accountable both by myself and by my community and maybe by my colleagues for behaving in a way that is more in alignment with this goal of liberation for all, not just for some of us, or privilege just for some of us at the expense of the loss of someone else's privilege. No, I want to be engaged in change work that allows for that expansion of privilege and really freedom for all.
I think that this idea of taking responsibility for yourself and really acknowledging the ways in which you have potentially harmed others and you assume privilege. There are all sorts of ways in which I think that the kind of like the taboo of admitting that we have made mistakes is so dangerous. As soon as it's kind of over in the corner in the closet, it becomes this very dangerous shadow. And it seems like there's a lot of that around privilege as well, too. It's like the things that we're unwilling to talk about, the things we're unwilling to own. That's what really makes people much more likely, I think, to be harmed in these spaces.
Oh, yeah. I love that you brought up shadow. Like the shadows, because I'm thinking again, like, well, what comes up when you're doing psychedelic therapy work? Naming those, I'm going right into it, like go into the shadow, and that's terrifying. Like speaking from experience, that can be terrifying. I'm not suggesting that you do that unprepared, but ideally, either as you're teaching, future therapists, or if you're actually working with a client in the therapy space, if you can name the thing, the shadow that's there and present, but we're just not talking about it, you're giving air to it. You're providing, you're opening up the space to actually change it and maybe diffuse it if it has, it's holding a lot of power, which that is so key. I think Ready for Psychedelics is going to doing that shadow work, which for many of us, and I don't want to say all of us, but I really, in my experience and, observed experience and also having read much evidence, the shadows that we experience as Westerners, writ large, around race and dominance and power relations, that is shared. We have that fear of talking about that subject. I think because there is willful ignorance, and refusal to accept our history as a nation, to look at, and again, I'm talking about the nation, but maybe all of the West or all of, those who have benefited from colonial power over others, that is the conversation we need to be having. It won't go away if we just ignore it. As you said, it's going to sit there in the corner. It's present. We're aware of it, but we're not actually dealing with it. We can't diffuse it. We can't dismantle it. We can't unlearn it if we don't name it. We don't want to talk about it. Let's not address it. But individually, we have the power to go right into the heart of the beast, and to unlearn it. I think it's helpful to do that with a supportive process, like Ready is very useful for this specifically because it's saying, there's a tried and true methodology here. And I don't even think it's that complicated. It looks different with every person, but every person who's engaged in it with me, I've watched kind of go through that process of dismantling the previously unexamined stories. And then at the end of that, recognizing, okay, well, now what do I do with that? And I, I do ready work individually. It's one-on-one work. But if I am working with an organization and a group of employees, for instance, they're all participating in this work, we'll work together for 6 months to a year or more in some cases to keep revisiting and then working with new, like, okay, so now each of you has done this work and you've worked together. What has come up? What have you noticed that's changed? What shifting dynamics can we identify? And what still needs to come through this process? What still needs to happen to reach a point of, true cultural humility for one another and for yourselves, and then to see something different coming out the other side.
Yeah. It sounds like a really powerful and transformative way to change ourselves and change the worlds we walk in and, spaces in our community.
Yeah. And then you add psychedelics to that, and the potential is limitless because, we're already primed for radical shifts in outlook. And it's just, to me, it seems like the perfect catalyst for change. But it's like this opportunity that I think I'm anticipating maybe one of your questions here, but I think more than anything, I'm excited about the psychedelic renaissance, as it's called, for that potential.
So for my last question, I would be curious, it's obviously the good side of the psychedelic renaissance. What keeps you up at night when you think about our psychedelic future?
Yeah, well, that's a bit of my, like, anticipating the question. What keeps me up is that we might miss that opportunity. What kind of revolutionary systems changing work could come from a lot of people having the psychedelic experience in which they just saw the world in a completely different way? And I think, as so often has been reported, seeing the world as artificially presented to us as if we are all in our separate silos and, we're meant to be fractured. I think the psychedelic experience often is just reassuring us or showing us maybe for the first time, no, actually we are all part of a whole. And back to that, I think I talked about this at the top, like the paradox of we are all one, but we are not the same. How can that be? So we're all one, but maybe we're all trying to get back to that oneness, and we'll get there by recognizing what these fractured, these stories that have led to fracturing between us, what those stories are, and how we can actually either piece ourselves back together, piece our communities back together, but how can we do that from a space of understanding that we have been forced into hierarchies, we have been forced into power over domination relationships. If we accept that has happened, then we can start figuring out what do we need to do to change that. And I don't want to miss that opportunity.
To learn more about Dr. Baalika McCaw's work with Radical Empathy Disrupts Entitlement, or READY, and her Ready for Psychedelics program, visit www.baalika.com. The Psychedelic Skeptic was created by me, Dr. Ann Metz. Our podcast music is by West Swing. The Psychedelic Skeptic is available on your favorite podcast app. And you can learn more at annmetz.com or follow me on Instagram at Dr. Metz. If you want to recommend a guest for the show or ask a question about psychedelic therapy, just send me a note at hello@annmetz.com. If you want to help the podcast, please share it with a friend or a family member. Or if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.